Hello, and welcome back to Take It or Leave It Movie Commentaries. As promised, today we're going to be looking at the very first episode of the original TV series Dallas that began airing in 1978. The name of this episode is Digger's Daughter. I'm not going to refer to it as the pilot because really the first 5 episodes of Dallas, which were aired as a mini series, were kind of all intended to be the pilot for a potential series. They didn't think much of it, did not think it was going to get picked up. But obviously it did and became a huge hit near the end of the 70s, and then, of course, was, um, was really a massive sensation in the 1980s. I remember watching the series Dallas with my parents and my grandparents, and if friends of theirs missed the first few minutes or the last few minutes, they would call and ask, "Hey, what did I miss? What happened?" This is before most homes had VCRs. Certainly, there were no streaming services or anything even similar to that. So you had to be home to watch the TV series and the episodes that you wanted to see. So that was it was an interesting time, and I miss a lot of those days. But of course, convenience always wins those battles. So we are where we are. But Dallas was definitely appointment television. As I mentioned, this began airing in 1978. I was far too young to remember whether or not my parents or anyone watched these first 5 episodes. There would have been really no reason for anyone to tune in because no one would have had any idea what the series was to become. But there's some interesting changes later on in the series, and you'll see how different the show became when you watch these first episodes, and really most of the episodes throughout the miniseries and the first full season, and even into season 2. It's kind of not the Dallas yet that most people who do remember the show would really recognize. It was not as serialized as it became, and there's some important differences with some characters that we'll get into. But I'm going to watch this on my Amazon Prime copy, so if you'd like to follow along with the commentary, you can start your copy of this right now. The show opens, of course, with the same iconic music that began the series for its entire run, and really a lot of the visuals they use here in the opening episode. This is called Digger's Daughter, by the way. I'm not sure if I mentioned that before, but a lot of these visuals were the same throughout. The Dallas logo you see there is different. There's the old Texas Stadium for the Cowboys. They did make some significant changes to the intro near the end of the series run. I think it was maybe, I don't know, when the show had about 3 seasons or so left. There's some interesting uh, cast changes or cast differences right away. You'll notice Linda Gray is not in the opening credits. Steve Canale is not in the opening credits, and Ken Kirchhoff is not in the opening credits, even though all of them would go on to play major roles on the show. And of course, the biggest difference you see right there is the home. It is not the South Fork that we're used to. It's a home called the Cloyce Box Ranch, which doesn't exist anymore because it burned down in 1987. But we'll get into some of the differences in the Cloyce Box Ranch and Duncan Acres, which became the South Fork that people are most familiar with. We'll get into that in a minute. And here's our first scene with Bobby and Pam driving down the street in Bobby's kind of signature car that he had for most of the series, which was the small red Mercedes convertible. And that alone is telling that the show opens with Bobby and Pam on their way home from South Fork, having just gotten married. The show was conceived as a Romeo and Juliet story, and was really intended as a starring vehicle for Victoria Principal. It was going to be kind of Pam against the rich Ewings, who always wanted her out. Fairly quickly, though, the writers realized that the main character of the show, even though it kind of became this way accidentally originally, was JR. JR was the one who was doing all the stuff that everyone else reacted to, and a lot of his prominence on the show was due to Larry Hagman's performance. His laughing and his grin and his sort of glee that he took in all the dirty stuff he did was so interesting and unique that they wrote more and more of the storylines around what JR was doing. And again, fairly quickly, he became the center of the show. But that happens sometimes with series. This is our first look here, by the way, at Larry Hagman. I don't know where they filmed these episodes as far as the interiors for Ewing Oil. That's Tina Louise from Gilligan's Island, by the way. She played Ginger on Gilligan's Island, but she's JR's first secretary we see on the show, Julie Gray. But you've seen supporting characters, although JR was not really considered a supporting character. He's more just part of an ensemble. But you've seen characters end up being the center of a show before. It doesn't happen often, but look at Happy Days with Fonzie, and then you could even throw the Urkel character in that became the center of the. I think I've never seen the show, but I think the show was called Family Matters. I love how JR just casually reaches back and puts his hand on Julie's leg like that. And the fact that JR, who I guess here is supposed to be about 40 or so, still refers to his father as "Hello, Daddy." The the character of Jock, supposedly they had offered and even spoke to John Wayne about being Jock, and you can certainly see that. Although he would have been such a big presence, it's kind of hard to imagine the show with John Wayne on it. But John Wayne himself, who I believe was already sick with cancer at that point, he recommended Jim Davis, who was a friend of John Wayne's. Jim Davis had fallen on some kind of hard times. He'd been making a lot of kind of B movies and needed some work, and he obviously, of course, ended up getting the job. And he didn't have a car. I guess his financial situation had gotten to the point where he couldn't afford a car. So the Lincoln that you see Jock driving was something that the producers actually bought for Jim Davis, and he used it as his personal car. And you can see that car at the South Fork Ranch that everyone remembers from the show. It's on display there. I mean, I guess after Jim Davis died, it reverted to back to the show. And you can see Victoria Principal here. I mean, was just obviously a very naturally just pretty girl. Later, she got really thin. This is all my personal opinion, by the way. She got really thin and had plastic surgery. Don't really know how much, but in my opinion, she got carried away with the fitness and the being so thin and everything else. She looks much better here in the pilot and in the early episodes of the show than she did later on. I mean, not that she, you know, made herself unattractive in any way, but I just think she's uniquely naturally pretty here in these early episodes of the show. And here's our first look at Ray. Steve Canale originally auditioned for the role of Bobby. Um, of course, ended up as Ray. And Ken Kercheval, who plays Cliff Barnes, that we got a quick look at on JR's television set in his office, he originally auditioned for the part of Ray. Patrick Duffy said, I believe it's in a commentary on one of the DVDs that was released for the series. He's mentioned that Steve Canale was one of the best actors ever on the show because you never doubted that he was a cowboy, or at least had some experience in being kind of a Western type of guy, and nothing could be further from the truth. Steve Canale was a Santa Monica kid who liked to drink martinis. So the fact that he looks so at home in a cowboy hat with a beer in his hand is, I guess, is a tribute to how good of an actor Canale was. This conversation between Ray and Jock sets up a couple of things. One thing, Jock's looking for Lucy, who is up at the top of the loft in a very strange kind of relationship with Ray. And then Jock asking Ray to tell Pam, who Ray dates occasionally, to try to get her brother to leave him alone. I'm not sure how Jock thinks Ray is supposed to pull that off, but I guess he's trying everything. But all that stuff happened so fast. I'm not sure if you were first watching this and not familiar with the characters. I don't know that you would have instantly picked up on, oh, Jock's talking about Pam that's coming home in the car with Bobby, and then this girl immediately is the Lucy he was looking for. Although it's, I think this conversation makes it more obvious. And we never really get. I mean, I would assume Lucy is supposed to be 15 here. So this scene right here between her and Ray, is who I guess is 30 something, is problematic for a lot of reasons. But of course, later on, we learn that Ray is actually uh, Jock's son. So this is also incest. I mean, although you could give the characters a pass on that because they don't supposedly know it, but they just kind of forgot about this whole Ray and Lucy thing very quickly. It is referenced in the very early episodes of the first full season, but after that they quickly pushed that aside for obvious reasons. Now, see here, they haven't even gotten home yet, and Pam and her character, which I guess this is true to her, to who she is, but she's already nagging him about getting more involved in the business. Now, if you didn't, you just married the guy. If you didn't like the way he was or didn't like his job, why did you marry him in the first place? She's already, giving him a bunch of heat about what he does for Ewing Oil. I mean, she starts right out of the gate, and the Pam character would continue with that sort of thing. Never happy with Bobby, never pleased with any decision he made, and Bobby, unfortunately, would much more often than not just come crawling back to her. Um, it can be really frustrating. There's a good look at the box ranch. In many ways, this home makes much more sense than the South Fork that they use later, the Duncan Acres home, because there's a main house that's much larger than Duncan Acres and might have a chance to fit all those characters that end up moving in and out of South Fork all the time. But it also has some separate homes on the same property. JR and Sue Ellen, who, and again, we haven't even seen Sue Ellen, which shows you the difference in this episode and what the series would later become. and we haven't seen Jr. again since that first office scene, which is would be very unusual for the show later on. But anyway, Jr. and Sue Ellen had their own separate home on the same property, and there's also a separate house where Gary and Val lived for a brief period when they were married and still living on the ranch. Jr. points that out to Pam later on, and I think it would be safe to assume that if they had stayed at the Box Ranch, Bobby and Pam probably would have moved into that separate house. So in many ways, this home makes more sense for this big family than the Duncan Acres place, where everyone's living under the same roof at all times. And if you had this set up with the separate homes, the family would still gather for drinks and have dinner together. I mean, you could still do all that, but yet, still retire to your own private place. So they could have still had the conflicts on the show that existed with them living under the same roof. Even that's a little strange. Bobby has just brought her home, and she already is wanting to freshen up. And she walks right into the house, like not, like she owns the place. Like, you have any, maybe let me show you around first. And this is kind of a lackluster scene with Bobby telling Miss Ellie that he's married Pam. If that had occurred later in the show, I think that would have been handled and written much differently. It's just all kind of done quickly, like, oh, hey, it's me. Here's my wife. And these are the interiors of the Aldridge house, which is on Swiss Avenue in Dallas, Texas. um, Much of the interior, I've never been inside the home, but from the pictures I've seen online, the interior of the home has changed very little from these scenes that you see here. Still got that very dark brown wood throughout the home, and is very recognizable if you're familiar with these first 5 episodes. It's later on they did interiors at a different home as well. It's a home on Park Lane that I don't believe is technically in Dallas. I think it's located in another little city, but and those were the sets that they then recreated on the sound stage for filming when they weren't actually in Texas. And this is, of course, another room in the Aldridge home. And there's our first look at Sue Ellen. Appropriately, she's holding a pretty deep glass of wine there, and Jr. of course is holding a drink. That's actually kind of a fitting shot. I think it's unintentional. They just had to seat people where they could be seen. But the fact that you can see Bobby and Pam there in the foreground and Jr., almost kind of in between them, sitting in that chair in the background. That's Again, I think that's probably an accident, but it's still interesting and some good symbolic shots. And look at how Lucy's sitting. It's like she's having a photo shoot. And this might surprise people too that are not familiar with the show in its early episodes. Jr. and Ray are buddies, and they go out raising hell together. Very different than the characters' relationship later. And look at Bobby with those huge collars and that tight chain around his neck. Looks like he just walked out of a disco, which he will be seen in a disco in this mini series. There's some really entertaining scenes of Bobby and Pam visiting a club and and getting down and enjoying some disco. This is kind of odd. It wasn't. It's not immediately apparent when JR's talking about showing Pam around that she's getting up to actually go do that. Um, and could Sue Ellen and Miss Ellie be sitting any closer? And the Box Ranch is a really nice looking house, very majestic. I mean, it's a shame that it burned, but it was a working cattle ranch, which is one reason they did not want the show around anymore. And Pam also goes with JR willingly. If Pam was familiar with the Ewings and the Ewing family, which she'd have to be, given that she's been there a lot, and she came with Ray to the barbecues, and she's known about the Ewing since she was a kid. She would know who J.R. Ewing is from his reputation, and I don't think she'd be so anxious to be friendly and nice and go off alone with him for a quick tour of the ranch. And she seems completely surprised when he makes the offer for her to go away. And there's the little house where Gary and Val lived. It's interesting that the show was already setting up that there is another brother and that he doesn't live there. Instead of just focusing on the characters right here. And I guess for this early episode, it wasn't so much thinking, well, we'll bring Gary in later or his wife. I think it was more just to give the character of Lucy some background. But but Jr. and Sue Ellen's home is also there. It looks like the smaller home is basically right next door. And that's our first glimpse of the JR kind of laugh and sinister glint in his eye. All the elements of what the show would become are here. They're just not quite um, not used in the same way yet. But it doesn't take them long to figure out what they had. This series was created by David Jacobs, and he later stepped out of the show and didn't take much of a role in it. Apparently, the guiding force later, and pretty early on in the show, became Leonard Katzman. David Jacobs originally approached CBS with an idea for a show called Scenes from a Marriage, which was about four or five couples living on the same street and just kind of the routine issues and problems that couples were facing and being part of the middle class in America at that time. And CBS said, well, this is just not glitzy enough. We want something with more drama and something more about a central family. So Jacobs went back and and created Dallas. Later on, after Dallas became such a huge hit and they wanted a spinoff, Jacobs went back to the original idea of the show about the married couples and just made one of the couples Gary and Val. So and that became Knots Landing. So he got his original idea made into a show despite everything anyway. In this conversation between Jock and JR, there when he says that my first grandson is going to be theirs in the early part of that conversation demonstrates the thing that frustrates me when I watch the show now about Jock and his relationship with JR specifically, but also the way he plays JR and Bobby off against each other. And if you want to do that, fine. But the rest of the family, particularly Miss Ellie, constantly acts as if, and Jock does too when he's still alive and on the show, as if it's all JR's fault. And really all he's doing is behaving exactly the way Jock taught him to behave. Later on, especially after Jock's death, they put the character of Jock on this pedestal as if he was always so honorable and always doing the right thing and all that, and that was not the reality of the situation. JR was more of Jock's henchman than anything else. And as far as his scheming with trying to get the one up on his own brother was Jock's own doing. That's the way he taught him. And it's interesting to kind of envision what that would have been like in the later episodes. I think it's safe to say, let Bobby and Pam get married. Right after that scene, the next scene following that would be for JR to go and commiserate with Sue Ellen, and depending on where their relationship was at the time, Sue Ellen even goading him about the fact that Bobby has married Pam, or commiserating with him about what he's going to do to get rid of it and all that. But we never see that. We see almost nothing of Sue Ellen's reaction to Bobby bringing Pam home. And I don't think I've mentioned this yet. The role of JR, I'm not sure if it was offered to Robert Foxworth, or if they just wanted to talk to Robert Foxworth about maybe playing the character, and he didn't want to have that conversation. But Robert Foxworth was at least considered for JR. I think later he must have realized he missed an opportunity because he was one of the stars of Falcon Crest, which was one of the primetime soaps, as they were called, that followed Dallas's success. But the thing that makes JR is Larry Hagman's performance, and I think it's safe to say, and this is not a negative comment about Robert Foxworth or anyone else, but no one else would have brought the traits to the character of JR that Hagman did, that made him such a great character and made the show such a hit. So, and Mary Fran, by the way, who you might know from the series Newhart with Bob Newhart, which is great, by the way, a very underrated sitcom, if you can really call it a sitcom. Either auditioned for or maybe was offered the role of Sue Ellen. And this is our first look at Cliff, by the way, and Pam's very late 70s apartment and luggage. Um, the Look at that lamp, and her shower curtain looks like it's a almost a orange. But you hear a lot of things with, oh, this guy was offered this part and they turned it down, and this person this and that. I mean, sometimes that gets misconstrued as the years go on. Oftentimes it's not so much that someone was offered the part, but they were maybe offered the chance to audition for a part, or they were offered even the chance to maybe talk about a part or something, and they turned that down. So it's hard to tell, if a part was actually offered to someone or not, and they turned it down or whatever. You see that a lot, and this is going way off track, but with the James Bond films, you hear about all these actors that were supposedly offered the role at one point or another and turned it down. And that's rarely, if ever, the case with things. I mean, they were typically offered the chance to try out for the role, maybe, or again, just offered the chance to talk about it, and that's what they didn't want to do. So that's why I don't like to say, like, just flatly so and so was offered something. That is appropriate though for Cliff's character right there, to not want to even get in the car. But then of course he does, And with what we learn about Cliff's character later on, I'm sure he very much enjoyed being in the nice leather seats of the Mercedes. Look at those huge 70s file cabinets. And it's rare too to see Bobby in a three-piece suit. And look at how short his tie is. JR wore three-piece suits regularly for a good part of the show. I can't think off the top of my head when he stopped wearing them. It was probably well into, I don't know, 84 or so. But this is different. JR doesn't have a three-piece suit on, and Bobby does. Later on, Bobby, if he did have a suit on, he would even have his tie not completely not completely knotted. He'd have the collar like he does here open to again display some youth and his more not carefree nature necessarily, but more youthful and open nature versus Jr. Who you know more often than not jacket was buttoned, suit was a three-piece suit, collar buttoned all the way up, tie completely tied. It's funny to look at little character things like that in a series. No, that's not exactly the greatest place to keep your safe. Probably. Why wouldn't that just be in JR's office? And the red file becomes very important later on, and the character of Julie Gray has a pivotal role in some of the upcoming episodes. And he hands the red file. Look at JR's red belt buckle. That's a lot. But he did that right in front of Bobby's new secretary, and wasn't exactly whispering. So wouldn't she maybe have mentioned that to Bobby in a second? JR doesn't seem very concerned about that. This is Cliff and Pam trying to track down, excuse me, trying to track down Digger to give him the news that Pam has married Bobby. Of course, they find him drinking at a bar. And this is a great way for some exposition here for Cliff and Pam to walk in and listen to him, to Digger telling this story to these people. It's a good way not to have to kind of explain this to the audience. Just just have Pam and Cliff walk in and listen to him explaining it to the other drunks. The guy right there, I don't know the name of the actor, but the guy sitting to the Digger's right and our left is in an episode later on as a drunk again. I think it's in the Dream season, as a matter of fact, and he's drinking with Sue Ellen. So I guess that guy never got over his alcohol problem and was even still an alcoholic in Pam's dream. Which I guess you could argue now that Pam sees him there, so I guess he gets stuck in her subconscious. But we won't go into that whole dream debacle right now. At least I hope I'm not going to. I could get on a rant about that pretty quick. Ugh. You know how bad he would smell after sitting there drinking with those people? And remember, this is when you could still smoke inside. So he would reek to high heaven of stale alcohol and cigarettes. And there, look at Victoria Principal there. Just very naturally pretty and hair, and her hair is not red, which is unusual. I mean, later on, her hair was always red. There, it's just a really dark brown. That's David Wayne, by the way, is Digger. And those are some good music cues. The music of this series was really a part of its success. Not so much here in these early episodes, but later on, these played a big part in ramping up the drama and the payoffs and the anticipation of what was to come. Now, I mean, really though, what did she expect? And look at how easily she's carrying that huge suitcase. She didn't put much in it. Um, I mean, Digger hates Jock, hates the Ewings, and Pam got upset because he stiffened up and didn't like the news. Actually, his reaction, given his level of intoxication, was fairly mild, in my opinion. Here's Sue Ellen just being bitchy. And here's Lucy telling the story of Gary and Val and why she's at South Fork without her parents. This room again is in the Aldridge house, and it still looks very similar. Based on the photos that I mentioned online that you can find easily, by the way, if you just Google Aldridge House. And Charlene Tilton does a really good job here. The problem, in retrospect, with casting Charlene Tilton as Lucy, she does a great job of playing the teenager here, but her her stature, because she is a very small, and I think that limited her ability for the role to, both limited her and limited the character of Lucy to grow with the series. I mean, she it was very difficult for her to get into adult situations because frankly she just really didn't look like an adult. Um and that's a shame because I think the show would have really benefited from some younger characters that revolved around Lucy and that would come into the show kind of because of Lucy, but they kind of quickly ran out of things for Lucy to do, particularly as JR became the focus of the show. What they're setting up here is a special relationship between Pam and Lucy. You don't see it yet here because Lucy's being so hostile toward her. But later, excuse me, Pam takes much more of a motherly approach, or maybe just a big sister approach to Lucy, and they become close. And I think it was intended that that relationship would be a significant aspect of the show. And while they did continue to be close and were definitely allies, it just it didn't really have much of an impact on the big storylines. And St. Pam has been here just one or two nights, and she's already incredibly irritated that Bobby has to go off and do something with his family. I, I can't get on board with her attitude here. I mean, did she expect Bobby to immediately just become a full time executive and turn his back on everything he's been doing for the last, what, 8, 9 years? And he's doing this because of her own brother and what he's trying to do. And again, Bobby just, okay, doesn't say anything like what I just said. Like, look, I've got to go because your own brother's trying to destroy the family business or even send us to jail. Well, that coat that JR has is a lot. I wonder if Larry Hagman borrowed that jacket from some of the actual ranch hands at the box ranch. And Pam falls into this little trap so easily. Even here, it's kind of hard to imagine she would be this gullible, but but she quickly learned her lesson. I mean, maybe a part of her would just like to, spend the day with Ray and forget about all this drama and these entanglements she's gotten herself into. This is the last time they would film in Texas when it was anywhere near cold. The uh, the the scenes at the actual South Fork Ranch were filmed in summer, so they were ready for the fall season, and it gets blazing hot and incredibly humid in Texas, and they would have to be out there for weddings and suits and even eating breakfast outside in suits and it didn't matter. I mean, you could be out there in a bathing suit and you'd still be just pouring sweat in Texas in the summertime. So they were pretty brutal days when they were filming in Dallas. They as cold as it was during the filming of the miniseries, they probably missed it once they got out there in the Texas heat in July. And you can see here this huge amount of time spent on Pam's character and all that. It's very different than than what the show would spend time on later on. Not that Pam became an insignificant force. I mean, I think the fact that uh, Victoria Principal left the show was kind of one of the nails in the coffin for Dallas's really strong days. The series was already starting to fade a bit when she left, just because audiences' tastes change over time and shows lose writers and and don't have the same quality of story and dialogue and everything else that they once had. So that's just a natural part of the business. But Pam, even though her role is really diminished by the time we get to her final season, um, I think still the show wasn't quite the same once she was gone, and that's kind of strange. I mean, I guess the show's producers and writers knew that Victoria Principal was going to leave the show at the end of that season, probably because she was getting ready to leave, and because they were already having to cut down on costs, so they would not have had the money to re-sign her anyway. Um, and so they just didn't give her much to do at all in her final season. It's kind of a waste. She spends most of her time just worrying about Christopher, and it's there's really not much for her to do at all. Always loved JR's big Mercedes that he had later. This is interesting the way they're filming this. They've taken the headrests out so you can get a better look at JR and Bobby. That would be really uncomfortable to ride that way for any length of time. And he has a lot of faith in Ray to get this done, to drive Bobby out to Ray's little cabin out here, or whatever it is. I mean, they could have easily shown up and there'd be nothing going on at all. They just left the helicopter running. I don't know if that's what you're supposed to do or not if you fly a helicopter, but it doesn't necessarily seem like the best idea. One thing about Ray is he stuck with those vests like that he wears here in these early episodes. That was kind of a staple of his throughout most of the show. They would also not later have had the character of Pam get this close to being unfaithful to Bobby so early in their marriage. They've only been married a few days, and she already comes very close to, to jumping in the sack with Ray. Later on, the character of Pam was presented as far too honorable and pure to do anything like that. I mean, remember once her and Bobby get divorced, and she begins seeing Mark Grayson, it takes her quite a while before she starts having sex with him. So the fact that she's, I guess, willing here just to have sex with Ray. Look at his little tiny little cabin. Um, is very different from the character that she would become. And really, the only reason she stops before she does have sex with Ray here is because she sees JR's car driving toward Ray's place. What's been fun about it? I threw you in freezing cold water. I mean, that's really been, and we rode in a helicopter. Is that really? I mean, what's been so fun about it? And I don't know if I'm assuming that Ray was supposed to genuinely seduce her, and they were going to walk in on the two of them. But I guess also as a backup, if since he threw her in the water, I mean, JR would know she'd have to be in this kind of state of undress so they could, if Ray just kept his mouth shut and let Bobby believe whatever he wanted to believe, then he'd think something had happened even if it didn't. But a problem with this plan here is there's no way that Jock would let Ray continue to be the foreman on the ranch if he had just had sex with his son's wife. So Ray's kind of cutting his own throat just to do a favor for JR. I mean, obviously he's got his own reasons, but that's kind of short sighted. Ray's living like the Unabomber out there. I never really thought about that before, but man, he's really roughing it. Bobby telling JR off here is a glimpse too, in this little part where he almost hits him. I mean, there's a glimpse of what the show would become. They don't realize it yet, but the JR versus Bobby rivalry would obviously become, if not the central focus of the show, but definitely a major part of the show's success. And there's kind of our first look at it. Yeah, it's a good thing the Unabomber wasn't on the loose yet. Ray'd be in some trouble. Be a good suspect. Yeah, see, Ray says that he just needed a little bit more time to actually seduce Pam. So I guess that was the actual plot. And there we get JR and another glimpse of what's to come. Although it's strange that they end, and they did this fairly often in the early episodes. They wouldn't end on someone's face. and that would kind of be the way the show would usually, each episode would usually conclude later on. It would often be on something else, on a car driving away like we just saw, or a building, or some kind of wide view of something going on. And obviously later on, for that episode to end on anything other than a close-up of JR would just not have happened. I mean, that was just what you saw most of the time. But anyway, there is the very first episode of a very historic series and one of the most successful TV series of all time. And it's interesting, as I've said, to go back and look how things start and how different they are from what from what something eventually becomes. And a lot of that is because of the performances of the actors, and that's a huge part of why JR became so popular and why the series became so popular, and the writers writing to that, kind of molding a character along with the actor as a series progresses. And I think it's one of the things that makes commentaries on television episodes, especially a series like this, so worthwhile and kind of eye opening. But I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any other requests, or if you'd like me to continue to do some commentaries about Dallas, just let me know in the comments. If you're of a mind to, please consider subscribing, and feel free to check back. I'll be doing videos pretty consistently. I don't have a regular schedule, but at least every couple of weeks I'll have a new commentary up. So thank you for listening, and I will see you again soon.